Thank you, Vicki. So Vicki's just gone over a number of both positive and negative impacts of various UN integration arrangements on humanitarian space. And some of you may be asking the question, she started with this policy that actually has language since 2006, and particularly since 2008, that is meant to protect humanitarian interests and space. So where's the disconnect? We found that the inconsistency in the way in which UN integration is being implemented stems from a number of factors. The first is the limited understanding and awareness of the policy and guidance, including as it relates to humanitarian space. The second is a lack of ownership of the policy by some UN agency and OCHA staff. The third is insufficient understanding of and appreciation for the operational importance of humanitarian principles amongst some staff of lead departments. Another is a lack of clear minimum standards related to humanitarian space issues in existing guidance. Another is a lack of transparency and accountability in decision-making. And the last is insufficient commitment and investment in the concept and its implementation across the UN system. Now, for those of you who've been following this issue for as long as it's been around, many of these tensions and or inconsistencies are similar to those that were highlighted in the 2005 report and review of integration by IDA. We came up with 25 detailed recommendations about how to begin to try and manage these tensions better, how to both prevent and mitigate potential negative impact of UN integration arrangements on humanitarian space, but also to begin to try and augment the benefit as was expressed in the policy. There is supposed to be significant benefit potential in UN integration arrangements for humanitarian assistance. But in order to leave time for the other panelists and an actual conversation with you all, I'm going to go over 5 main areas of recommendations that we've made in the report. First and foremost, UN integration arrangements should be determined by the context, as reflected in UN integration policy since 2006. So this is beyond just the whether you are in a conflict or a post-conflict situation. As we know, conflicts are dynamic. Rather, it's the nature, dynamics, and stage of the conflict, the geopolitical context, and the history of UN engagement. These all have a bearing on how UN integration arrangements affect humanitarian space, and the variables, there are many, are gone into great detail in Chapter 4 of the report. In high-risk environments where the UN political or peacekeeping mandate and activities are challenged or contested, where violent conflict is highly likely or ongoing, and actors are able and willing to distinguish between humanitarian and other entities, greater caution in establishing certain integrated structures is required. And this means that particular structural arrangements, such as the integration of OCHA into the mission, or the creation of the triple hat DSRSG RCHC, are not likely to be appropriate in such environments, since a more distinct identity for UN humanitarian programming and coordination may be necessary to ensure more effective operations. Second, in contexts where there is significant humanitarian need, the mandate, scope, and nature of the political and peacekeeping mission should be informed by humanitarian considerations. This means that coordinated sensitization of member states is needed to ensure that the language used in mandates supports rather than undermines the distinction between the UN's humanitarian and political or peacekeeping objectives, and to minimize overlap between mission and UN agency or OCHA functions. And for those of you here representing a member state, it also means that member states should explore how they can ensure greater coordination within their own governments on their input into mandates. So, for example, have the humanitarian and political and development departments or focal points within a UN mission, or here at the Foreign Office coordinated their input into a mandate before submitting that in New York. Third, effective leadership at all levels of the UN system is crucial to the success of integrated arrangements. Decisions and risks must be informed, shared, and supported by stakeholders from the Secretary General and Undersecretary Generals heads of agencies, funds, and programs down through all levels of leadership at headquarters and in the field. In particular, senior UN staff operating in UN integrated presences, both in missions and in UN agencies, should have the appropriate skills and competencies to lead or support the humanitarian response, including the ability to manage competing priorities. Noting the scale and the nature of the task being asked of SRSGs and DSRSGs, RCHCs, and the weaknesses of many senior managers in understanding both the operational relevance of humanitarian principles and how to manage them in relation to other mission priorities, informal and formal mechanisms should be put in place to support senior mission staff. But more robust accountability is also necessary at all levels for noncompliance with the UN integration policy, including as it relates to the protection of humanitarian space. This is an issue that has been already mentioned in the UN Secretary General's latest policy on integration, which was released in May 2011. Let me just put a little bit of flesh on this. There are a number of policies and structures that have been created both at UN headquarters and in the field to not only allow for the engagement of UN and non-UN humanitarian actors, but also to try and manage the tensions and trade-offs. So obviously, there are going to be questions around sequencing and prioritization that need to be debated. Many of those structures exist, but when we spoke to stakeholders, there was a concern that there was a lack of a place to have a final resolution when there was a conflict, or when a specific individual or a department, agency, fund, or program detracted from the policy, that there was no accountability there. So it's my understanding that DPKO and the ISG are now taking steps to try and address this issue, and I'm sure that either David or Allegra can address that issue later. Fourth, guidance should clarify how integration arrangements should take account of humanitarian principles and allow for the protection of humanitarian space. Greater clarity is necessary on minimum requirements relating to humanitarian space issues in integration arrangements. More consistent and strategic engagement from humanitarian actors in the design, implementation, monitoring, and review of integration arrangements is also necessary to ensure more informed decision-making. And greater sensitization of non-humanitarian UN staff on the operational relevance of humanitarian principles may also help mitigate tensions arising at both headquarters and the field levels. Now, one of the issues that we heard often in this study, and we continue to hear in the launches, is the high transaction costs that come with integration. UN humanitarian agencies and NGOs have to create space to engage in a consistent way in these integration mechanisms. But we also heard that the fact is many of the tensions and trade-offs that arise would be there with or without integration. They are there because there is a political or peacekeeping operation on the ground, often a UN one, as well as UN agencies that have shared interests and objectives, and therefore the integration structures offer some sort of forum in order to have that conversation. And finally, as Vicki mentioned earlier, trust and confidence is lacking within and beyond the UN system. If UN integration is to be successful, UN leadership, and particularly the Integration Steering Group which commissioned this study, must consider how its members can implement these recommendations in practice and build confidence and trust among the humanitarian, UN and non-UN, and political peacekeeping communities, both at the headquarters level and in the field. And similarly, the IASC should engage more with lead departments. For example, lead departments briefing to IASC members on country-specific situations. I violated the acronym rule. I apologize, Chair. Again, I encourage you to look at the detailed recommendations in the study in Chapter 6, but in order to save time for more discussion, I'll turn it back to the Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much.